Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. The session that we have is on the prison industrial complex and the medical industrial complex and the abolition of the two. And then you can go to the next slide, please. So acknowledging those who have been nurturing this land long before its violent colonization is only a beginning step in repairing the harms that have been done to Indigenous peoples. So I'm going to read this land acknowledgement. Today, a majority of us are joining in from the Chicago region or Chicago. Let us always remember that we are on Indigenous land. This region that we now refer to as Chicago, along with a larger region, has always been home to Indigenous peoples, including the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe, and the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia Nations, the Miamia, the Wea, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Thakawaki, the Meskwaki, the Kickapoo, and the Mascouten, among many other Indigenous nations. Chicago is also home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. The institutions that we work in and for are settler colonial structures on land stolen through genocide against Indigenous communities. These structures have and continually exploit Black and Indigenous people, and we must be cognizant of that when we have conversations about racial justice, for these conversations are intrinsically linked to conversations for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, as well as conversations about transnational solidarity. It's our responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and to build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we're situated. So for the next 2 hours, please do what you need to do in order to be present. We want the space to be for everyone. So if that means only communicating in the chat, feel free. If you'd like to keep your video off for most of it, do that as well. Take a stretch break, make some tea, do whatever you need to do in order to be taking care of yourself during this time. And if your access needs aren't being met, you can go ahead and reach out to me, Cami, or Maya through the private message, and we'll see what we can do in the moment. The Chicago Health Coalition for Black Lives is a group of healthcare students and professionals who are fighting for collective liberation, and our political education team aims to raise our critical consciousness and also create an open access curriculum by recording sessions such as this one that we can store on our website. And I'll let Kay introduce himself.
Hi, can y'all hear me? Okay, so I'm Kay. I use they, them pronouns. And before I get into the presentation, I just want to say I'm really excited tonight because I feel like the last 2 presentations I've had in this series, they've both been on days when I've not been as present as I would like to be, or there are huge technical difficulties. And so now I feel like this presentation is actually going to be reflective of who I am. I'm knocking on wood. So yeah, I just wanted to put that disclaimer out if this is not your first session that you've been to of mine. But yeah, I'm a macro social worker. I've been a social worker for around 2 years, and I'm currently based in Brooklyn. I earned my master's of social work at the University of Michigan. Most of my work revolves around prison abolition and also ending sexual violence. And I'm an active member of Survived and Punished New York chapter. And we're a grassroots group working to free criminalized survivors of gender and sexual violence. And outside of Survived and Punished, I do abolitionist organizing in various collectives across New York City, and I'm a co-creator of aidtoabolition.com. And you can follow me on Instagram at Agbebiyi. Yeah, so we'll just take a couple minutes for everyone to introduce themselves in the chat.
And I'll also introduce myself. My name is Cami. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a medical student in Chicago at the moment. But currently I'm in Oakland.
And I'm Maya. I'm she, her pronouns, also a medical student in the Chicago area. Feel free to reach out if you have any technical needs or questions.
Okay, people can keep introducing themselves, but I'm gonna go to the next slide. If I can figure out how. Oh, okay, so yeah, here are some of the grounding and working agreements. The first is show up as you are. The second is take care of yourself in the space. I know that we said it'll be around 2 hours, but I don't envision the presentation / workshop going that long. But if you need to leave and get water, that's totally understandable. This is collaborative. Let's learn together, especially if I'm asking questions. Like, it's really helpful if people like interact with me so it doesn't feel like I'm just talking to my screen. Ask questions, and there will be questions at the end, and take space or make space. And there are 2 phone numbers on the screen if you need to text. I believe those are y'all's numbers. Okay, yeah, if you have any questions. Okay, so yeah, this is meant to be a facilitated conversation, not a lecture. So participation and questions, like I was saying, are totally welcome and encouraged. And if you need to ask a question, you can use the chat, and there will be a Q&A at the end, like I said. So this is the agenda for tonight. We already did the intros and the grounding. The first section will be like an introduction to the prison industrial complex and the medical industrial complex. The second section will be about those 2 complexes intersecting. The third section is kind of interesting. It's about aid to abolition, but it's also about some critiques that I and another member / creator of aid to abolition are like working through right now. So I wanted to like be transparent about that while giving this presentation. And then at the end, we'll just talk about like some activities or like some things that you can do that are happening right now around the issue, and then time for question and answer. Yeah, so I didn't really spend that much time getting into the prison industrial complex for this presentation because I've kind of covered it in the other 2. So if you have questions, you can ask at the end. But prison industrial complex is basically a term that was modeled after the military industrial complex, and it was created by organizers in an abolitionist group called Critical Resistance. And the official definition is the prison industrial complex is a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. So like basically in everyday language, it's just talking about the different powers that be and how they work together to keep people incarcerated. And they're working together to keep people incarcerated, not because of safety or like white definitions of safety, but they're doing so for profit. And then the second definition, I was going to just use this in general because I've been engaging more with Professor Ritchie's work. And when I was researching, I realized that she works at UIC. I think she's like the department head for the criminology and law and justice department. So I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. But she talks about in her work, prison nation. And she says, when I use the term prison nation, I'm referring both to the actual existence and control exerted through the prisons, jails, prisons, detention centers, secured halfway houses, the actual buildings, and the ideology. So it's both a literal meaning and a metaphorical meaning. Yeah, I use both of these definitions now interchangeably, especially because prison nation talks about the ideology that goes along with prisons and not just like the literal structure of them. And yeah, so before I became disabled, like I thought that like ableism was just like, I mean, like on paper, like I thought it was just like discrimination people like had towards you if you were disabled. And then after becoming disabled, I've since like been connected to a really great and awesome disability justice community. And I've learned more about ableism and more about the definitions that people are using. And this one is from an organizer and a lawyer named T.L. Lewis. And TL defines ableism as a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and/or the ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. I feel like I'm talking at y'all a lot, so I'm going to take a break for a second so that people can use the chat. But I guess a question I have is, through your studies, do you regularly have conversations about ableism? Is that something that you learn about or discuss? Someone said, it's not regularly discussed in our medical curriculum. Someone else said, I'm an M1 and have never had ableism mentioned in a class. Does one more person want to say something? Okay, at UIC, we had our introduction to, oh my gosh, to disability lecture last week where we discussed ableism. Someone else said we touched upon it last week at a mandatory lecture and had group discussions. We had a session last week on the experience of individuals with disabilities. In art school, I had a class led by a really famous disability rights advocate, but I don't know if that's relevant. That's relevant. Their name was Joseph Grigley. Yeah, so when I was getting my master's of social work, I never really heard any discussions of ableism except for one class where I had a professor who was disabled. Someone said, we have discussed disability occasionally, and I believe we're having another session on disability next week, not specifically ableism. Okay. Yeah, so that's just something that's interesting to think about, especially people who are in the medical professions or helping professions, how we're supposed to be helping people or working with people, and we're not even having discussions about these systems that impact them and also impact us, especially because over half of people who are incarcerated are disabled. And so, yeah, we can't have a discussion around prison abolition or what takes place within prisons without talking about disability justice, especially because even if someone comes into prison and they're not disabled, the act of being in prison can also be disabling. And then this is another person whose work I've engaged with before, who also, I guess, teaches or works at UIC. And their name is Liat Ben Mosh. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But they do a lot of work around carceral ableism. And they said, when disability is present, it is conceived as a deficit, something in need of correction, medically or by the correction industry, what I refer to as carceral ableism, but rarely as a nuanced identity from which to understand how to live differently, including reevaluating criminal justice responses to harm. So this is a really busy chart, but yeah, this serves as an introduction to the medical industrial complex. And the reason I like this chart is because it was made by disabled, primarily people of color, primarily women of color who worked together to make this chart over time. And that to me makes it feel more relevant than a chart I could find somewhere else, in an academic journal. But the medical industrial complex refers to the health industry, which is composed of the multi-billion-dollar conglomerates of enterprises, including doctors, hospitals, nursing homes, insurance companies, drug manufacturers, hospital supply and equipment companies, real estate and construction businesses, health systems, consulting and accounting firms, and banks. I guess I have the same question. Is this something that you regularly like talk about or think about when you're in your classes? Yeah, and people can also go off mute. That would be great. M1 at Chicago, nope. We don't talk about this at UIC, at least not directly like this. No, I don't believe we've ever talked about the healthcare industry as a whole. Not the ugly parts, at least. I guess another question I have is, when I was in grad school, I experienced, like when I went into grad school, I was like, oh yeah, like I'm gonna do all this, and like this is a passion where we like help people. But then I realized quickly that was like not the case. Someone named Chris kind of alluded to this, but like, has anyone learned things throughout med school that like have caused them to change their beliefs about medicine or the medical industrial complex in general? Maya says, we have a course called Health Systems Science that discusses these concepts, but not in any kind of critical way. Daniel says same.
I feel like none of my good education about the medical industrial complex has actually come from the curriculum and just from sessions like this, the reading.
I'm gonna pull up the chart so that it's bigger. But also, yeah, this, I don't know, I just really like the way that it's laid out, especially when talking about like desirability. I think that's something that people might not think of when they're talking about like disability justice or also like power or oppression. So that's something that's really important. And also like there's a resource list that's going to go around that will have like a link to this. So these are 3 of the people who have done a lot of work around disability justice, but specifically that chart and also defining the medical industrial complex. The top person is Patty Byrne, and the middle person is Kara Page, and the bottom person is Mia Mingus. And Mia Mingus does a lot of work around transformative justice too, and also just like abolition work. So she's someone who I really admire. But they said, the medical industrial complex is an enormous system with tentacles that reach beyond simply doctors, nurses, clinics, and hospitals. It is a system about profit first and foremost, rather than health, well-being, and care. Its roots run deep, and its history and present are connected to everything, including eugenics, capitalism, colonization, slavery, immigration, war, prisons, and reproductive oppression. It is not just a major piece of the history of ableism, but all systems of oppression. And then later on, they go, we are asking why we have so few options when it comes to our healthcare needs, and why insurance and pharmaceutical companies get to call the shots on the kind of care we receive or don't. Why don't we talk more about the ways that forced medicalization has become a part of our prison system, or how non-Western and alternative healing practices are often no less ableist than Western medical practices? We are asking, what could health, wellness, care, accessibility, and sustainability look like in practice outside of theory? We are revealing where and how the medical industrial complex is already in our lives in ways we might not have thought of before. We are urging us all to connect the MIC to our political work, because healing, wellness, care, health, and disability are part of whatever liberatory work we're engaged in. I really like this point where they talk about how non-Western and alternative healing practices are often no less ableist, because I think like a lot of disabled people will encounter like people who are like, oh, have you tried X, Y, and Z? And this is like something that's supposed to be like I guess, more open-minded because it's not like provided by a doctor. But even those kind of like practices still can perpetuate ableism. So how does this like interact with COVID? So, I mean, I don't know if this, well, I know this isn't a popular opinion, but I included this in the presentation because it's my opinion. So there's two ways, or there's multiple ways, but two of the ways that I've chosen to identify is that one, I feel like with COVID, we've normalized surveillance of other people's health choices. So something that I've noticed or like talked about a lot is just that people are now able to see themselves in their neighbor or like see themselves in their community, but they're only able to do that so that they can monitor their movements and make sure that individual people are following what they deem to be the correct protocol. And so that's not me saying that like we shouldn't all be trying to stay home and we shouldn't all be wearing masks. But one thing that COVID has done is really kind of like amplified and like normalized the fact that people feel entitled to surveil on other people instead of focusing on like plugging that energy into like large scale organizing. And one of those ways is through Instagram and Twitter accounts like this one called Gays Over COVID. And basically this account, if you're gay, usually a gay man, they'll take a picture of it and post it on this account if they see that you're not like following proper COVID protocol. And I know people think that that's funny or like that people deserve it, but the issue with these accounts is when you engage in this kind of behavior, sorry, it says my internet connection is unstable. Can y'all still hear me? Okay, when you engage in this kind of behavior, you're leading people down a slippery slope to like the criminalization of like I said, like people's health choices. And something that like made it extremely clear is one of the Gays Over COVID Instagram accounts revealed someone's HIV status to everyone. And people thought that was okay. And that's not okay. But because of COVID, people feel energized to like engage in this kind of behavior. And then there's also been cases where people have been accused of trying to intentionally spread COVID, so arrested for like coughing on people, whether or not they have COVID. And stuff like that just feeds the prison industrial complex, and it doesn't actually really do anything to keep us safe. Yeah, if you see a gay person and post a picture of them on this Instagram site, that doesn't stop the transmission of COVID. And it also doesn't like you can't go back in time and like undo what they did. The only thing it does, in my opinion, is it ruptures community ties that we'll need later for organizing. And then another way that COVID like intersects with like the medical industrial complex, but also the prison industrial complex, is just that prisons have high rates of COVID and they also have awful medical care. And because of COVID, people are not, it's more difficult to, well, for a lot of places, you can't visit your loved ones. Often, even if you're writing letters, those are restricted. If I'm like emailing someone like through JPay, that's restricted because of COVID. So there's less communication. And when you're within a prison, social distancing is essentially impossible. And the most interesting thing about COVID is people who brought COVID into prisons were the guards. That's how COVID like originally spread within prisons. And so they're bringing COVID in, but the people who are punished for it are the people who are already incarcerated. And this is something that hopefully most people know about. It's just the fact that like COVID heavily impacts people of color more than white people. And this is a chart from the CDC. But yeah, it's pretty morbid. But if you look at the cases compared to like white people, like for American Indian or Indigenous people, you have 1.8 times cases. For Black people, you have 1.4 times. And then once people like move into hospitalization, they're going to get like less, they're not going to get as good of care as their white counterparts are. And that's something that people need to be thinking about as well. So yeah, those are some examples of how the medical industrial complex interacts with the prison industrial complex, but we wanted to do like an activity where people brainstorm more examples, and Maya just put a link in the chat, and it's a Google Doc where people can put in their answers. And I'm going to give everyone like 10 minutes. So you can answer and you can also take a break. Someone on the doc used an acronym I'm not familiar with, SUD. If you could check that out, that'd be great for me. Thank you. Wow, y'all wrote a lot. I'm thinking that people who wrote stuff like, does anyone want to, well, I think it'd be awesome if a couple of people who wrote stuff on the doc elaborated on their points. And then after that, I'll go through some that I also noticed as well. And I will wait for someone to speak, so.
I can talk about what I wrote. My name is Chris. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a first-year medical student at UIC. I grew up near Boston, so that's how I know about this. In the state of Massachusetts, there's a thing called a Section 35. It's different from the regular, not the regular, but like there's also like a Section 12, which is also sometimes called a Baker Act or blue papered. That's like the involuntary psychiatric hold for 72 hours that exists in most states. But in Massachusetts, there's a Section 35, and that's different. That's when a family member can file a petition, go before a judge and say, my family member is using drugs. They need to get sober, but they're not willing. And then that judge writes a warrant for that person's arrest, basically, and mandates them to 3 months of treatment. And the treatment happens at Bridgewater, which is a prison, and it's not treatment, and there's not sufficient counseling. There's no medical care. People often don't get Suboxone or methadone or any, like drugs to help detox. I read a story once that about someone's child who she had him sectioned thinking it was the best option, and then like lived to regret it because he was just so traumatized. And that's what happens. These people are just so traumatized by the experience of having their agency taken away, and by the experiences of being just like punished with, this kid was punished with, he was an adult, he was like in his 30s, punished with like solitary confinement for not eating a meal. And he couldn't eat it because he was so sick from detoxing from heroin, I think. And they're not, facing criminal charges. So it's not even for like a criminal thing. And it's purely because people think that they have the right to take away the agency of people with disabilities and mental illnesses. So yeah, it's pretty horrible.
Thank you for elaborating. Does anyone else want to?
I can speak. Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm an M1. I use she, her pronouns. I added on to the doc about the lack of contraception or barriers in prisons. I think it's kind of far-fetched to assume that everyone would want to abstain from sexual activity. So I feel like if that does happen, that there should be an option just in case to prevent the spread of sexually transmitted diseases and things like that, to have that option if that were to happen.
Thank you. Does one more person want to elaborate?
I can talk about what I wrote. It's actually a personal experience. It's my only experience, I guess, related to jail and prison, and it's personal experience with my brother, who's currently in jail, and they've been pushing his trial back over and over and over again. And they keep saying, oh, due to COVID, you're going to have to just wait in here and, wait for your trial. And meanwhile, he was shot before he was put in jail. So this whole time he's not been receiving adequate medical care, and he has like an infection right now, and he's at risk of losing his right leg because he can't walk. They don't give him therapy. They don't do a lot of things there. And yeah, we're really concerned about him. That's why most of the reason why I'm here right now learning about this.
Thank you for sharing. I'm sorry that's happening. Yeah, I guess a couple of things that I'm noticing here are just well, a point that I never really considered is food prepared in prisons may contribute to non-communicable disease rates or lead to conditions not previously diagnosed. Before I was talking about how prisons can be disabling, and that's an aspect I never really thought about. Criminalizing pregnancy and pregnant people. There was also the mention about like criminalizing sexual activity. I think the main thing that like really made me more like open-minded to prison abolition was just realizing like how little, how non-existent sexual autonomy is within prisons. Like every single thing like related to like reproductive care, reproductive like rights or sex, even like if it means like being safe from sexual violence, incarcerated people are like, they're robbed of that within prisons. And I think that that's something that a lot of people don't want to grapple with because that would force them to actually think about prisons as sites of sexual violence, which they are. But yeah, there's a lot of great answers on here. Well, not great. There's a lot of informative answers on here. So I encourage you to go back and look through this later. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second. Yeah, so I think most of these have been like touched on the previous slide, but here's some other examples that we thought about when we were planning. Mandated reporting, cops arresting patients, healthcare within prisons like shackled births, forced sterilizations, lack of menstruation care, sexual harm due to no consent, redefining what, oh, this is like what I was talking about earlier about how like we need to redefine like what constitutes as sexual harm, especially within prisons, and also forced institutionalization. Going back to that previous point, just like things like mandatory like strip searches, like that's a form of sexual violence. Or like people not having like access to menstruation products, like I define that as sexual violence as well. And those are, I guess, like less seemingly like overt ways that we've normalized sexual violence within prisons. Okay, so yeah, like I said in the introduction, I co-created Aid to Abolition with a group of comrades, and basically Aid to Abolition was, I don't really, every time I try to describe it, I don't know how to describe it. Like it's not a policy platform. It's basically just a response to a group of reforms that were going around called 8 Can't Wait. And basically 8 Can't Wait argued that if all the 8 reforms that were proposed were implemented, police violence would go down by 72%. And Aid to Abolition argues that all form of policing is violent. And also these reforms were already implemented in places where people have died from police violence. And we think that in order to stop police violence, we need to eradicate policing in prisons. So yeah, and there's 8 different parts of the platform. And the part that I was going to, sorry, I'm calling it a platform, but it's not a platform. There's 8 different parts to the thingy. And one of them is invest in care, not cops. I'm just laughing because I was on Twitter, but I deleted my Twitter, but someone accused Aid to Abolition of being like a nonprofit. And one of the responses was just like, it's just an Instagram graphic. And so whenever I'm talking about it, that's what I'm thinking about because that's truly what it is. So yeah, I think that like when we were coming up with like the 8 different components, invest in care, not cops, was something that was important to us, especially because Me and 2 or 3 of the other people working on Aid to Abolition were involved in an invest/divest campaign, which is basically like a model organizing towards abolition, where you're arguing that people should be divesting money, or government should be divesting money from policing and investing that into resources that people need. And that kind of framing took off a lot this summer. And it also, I think, took off a lot because of Aid to Abolition. But now that things have kind of calmed down, something that Mon, the original creator of Aid to Abolition, and I had been talking about is just a little bit of the issues that we have with like divest/invest framing, and how like we think that it's a good way to like bring people into abolition, but the framing might not always be reflective of like what we actually want. So we're working on an article about it, but basically one of the issues we have is just like when it comes to stuff like invest in care, not cops, like what is care, especially like within the United States, like the only models of care that we really like know about or have examples for are usually just as anti-Black and just as coercive as prisons. And so when we use like slogans like invest in care, not cops, it kind of insinuates that we all have the same definition of care. Another issue is just that like sometimes people will make the argument that like policing is, or like people don't have like access to the necessities they need because policing like eats up so much of the money. But that's not true. There's actually enough money to go around. Like police, like an investment in policing is not just like simply like an apolitical like budgeting decision. It's like, it's very intentional. And so just kind of like acting like, or like, I think sometimes people think like, oh, like if we just move the money from here to over there, like everything will be fixed. But that doesn't change the fact that like these same people who will be tasked with moving the money over to better services, those are the same people that were investing that money into policing to begin with. So that doesn't mean that their analysis around policing has actually changed. Yeah, and then another issue that Mon and I are thinking about with divest invest is just kind of like it can be used to further narratives of innocence. So as an abolitionist, I don't believe in like the like guilty or like innocent like thingy. Like I don't believe in that. And I also know that like what we like deem as innocence is usually almost exclusively like tied to whiteness. And so a lot of people who will talk about divest invest will say like, oh, well, like a lot of crimes are committed because of economic need, which is true, but not all crimes are because of economic need. There are just violent crimes that happen. And so if we're just going to focus on like non-violent people, we're going to leave a huge amount of incarcerated people behind. And so something that we're thinking about right now is just what are some long-term demands we can make that don't involve the shuffling around of funds. And one good thing about this strategy was it did pull a lot of people into abolition, but we're trying to think more of like strategies that can pull people in, but also don't kind of like move us backwards in the sense of what we're working for. So yeah, this is going to be a slide about like why we should invest in care, not cops, but now it's a slide about like how I'm not really sure that that's the thing anymore, but that's just something that we're working through. And yeah, we're wrapping up, but I just wanted to go over some alternatives to what we have right now. And one of the alternatives is this group called Project Let's, and they're based in Rhode Island. And the creator is actually an abolitionist. And excuse me, basically, they do peer support for mental health, or they say mental healing. And so, sorry, I keep having to burp. When people are experiencing mental health crises, they can talk to trained peers instead of police, or like even people like social workers or therapists. They've also implemented mandatory suicide training for people working with youth in New York State from 7th through 12th grade. They're also doing a lot of work drawing the connection between mental and physical disability and ableism. And there's chapters across the country. They're also involved with a lot of financial support and mutual aid right now. And like I was saying, they have the crisis line, which I think is really great. And then another like model that people can be looking to is harm reduction. And harm reduction is typically like used around people, like the idea is typically used to refer to people who use drugs. But what harm reduction like argues or does is accepting drug use as a part of our society, and it's more focused on ending the harmful stigma attached to people who use drugs versus the condemnation, and also making sure that people who use drugs have access to safer ways to do it. And there are a lot of nonprofits who do like harm reduction work, but most of my interaction with harm reduction work has been through like anarchist formations who do a lot of education around this, and especially through like zine creations. And as I was putting this together, I was like, oh, it's Inauguration Day. But there's a great article, I think, called Voting is Not Harm Reduction, which was put together by a bunch of Indigenous anarchists. And that will be in the resource page later. And harm reduction can include safe injection sites, clean needle exchanges, and also sober spaces for people who don't want to use drugs in that moment. And also another great thing about harm reduction is it involves a deeper understanding of how drug usage functions under capitalism. I think I might have gotten the message.
I just put the article in the chat.
Okay, thank you. And something that I've kind of been moving more into this year is just organizing against mandated reporting. I primarily know about this through working with social workers, but there's social workers, teachers, and healthcare professionals who are fighting against mandated reporting. And in case people don't know, basically mandated reporting is just this, well, for social work, if you're going to be a licensed social worker, you're agreeing that if you know that people are engaging in illegal activity, especially in regards to like children, you're legally required to report that to the police. And in many states, like any adult, it doesn't matter what your profession is a mandated reporter. I think it's in 18 different states. And people who are organizing against mandated reporting are also building up alternative structures that don't create harm. And they're also disrupting systems of power. And there's several collectives, especially of social workers right now, who are making materials like the ones that I have listed in the resources. But this, I'm sorry, I couldn't do the image description for this, but it's on the website. But this is a poster about mandatory reporting, and it's from a website that I included in the resources. I can't remember the name. Maybe it's Against Mandated Reporting. And a group of social workers came together and made a lot of informational activity about it. Not activity, informational things, materials. So yeah. And then the last alternative is just disability justice. And so disability justice is, it's like an organizing framework that was created after disabled people or disabled organizers noticed the lack and within the disability rights movement around issues like racism or like classism, etc. And so disability justice is, it's more disability rights, more radical counterpart. You'll notice a lot like that I don't use person first language, or I don't refer to myself as a person with disabilities. And that's because a lot of my analysis around like me being a disabled person is informed by people who are organizing around disability justice. But yeah. Like I said, it's a framework that understands ableism through an interconnected anti-oppression lens. So that includes classism, sexism, anti-Blackness, etc. And a lot of disability justice organizers rely on the social model of disability, which is basically this way of viewing disability. I'm trying to think of like how to explain it. So basically, I call myself a disabled person because by saying that, I feel like I'm personally naming that there's a system, capitalism, that is like disabling me, that I wouldn't view myself as disabled if I personally had access to all the things that I needed and I could live in a world without ableism. So by me calling myself a disabled person, I'm naming that there's a force or a system of oppression that's actively disabling me. And that's the end of the presentation. I'm gonna stop sharing but feel free to ask any questions in the chat, or you can say them out loud too.
I just have a quick question about the Let's crisis line and kind of other crisis lines. How do those, and the ones that I've worked for in the past, they're kind of like the resources they're able to offer people beyond listening are go to a hospital or call the cops. Like, how do crisis lines kind of move past that framework and also also including like safety planning? But yeah, I guess less of a question and more of a like an unformed thought.
Yeah, first I want to say, completely unrelated, when I switched back from the Google slides or the Google Doc to the presentation, I forgot to click captioning again. So I'm sorry if any of y'all were relying on that. But there wasn't captioning for the presentation after that, and I apologize. But yeah, so you were saying that a lot of crisis lines typically like involve like forced hospitalizations or calling the cops.
At least the one I have experience with, that is kind of like up the higher chain of like escalation if necessary, after recommending other things or talking about other options. Yeah,
so I'm not an expert on how Project Let's like crisis line functions, but I do know that when I was talking to the founder the other day, I do know that I don't think that like in any case, like after talking through the crisis line, people have ended up going to the cops or even a hospital afterwards. I think that like Project Let's and other groups that are similar to it are really doing the work of like demystifying mental health treatment. Because as like a mentally ill person and someone who's also a social worker, I don't think there was anything in my program that I really learned that made me like more prepared to like deal with my own mental illness or like help others with it. And so I think Project Let's, and they had like an article a couple months ago that was just arguing against replacing cops with social workers. But they're working to bring the information that like social workers or therapists might learn in an academic setting. But they're really emphasizing the fact that like anyone can learn these tools to help other people. And you don't necessarily have to be like a licensed professional to help people, especially if they're going through a crisis. Someone said, what are common things people say to you against prison abolition and how do you respond? This is a question I get a lot, and it's also like, it's also why like this is my last like public speaking thing of the year, probably. But yeah, I'll be back next year. So I guess I'm trying to think of common things. I mean, the most common thing is like, what about the murderers or what about the rapists? Or like, do you think everyone should be free? Or a common one is like, oh, you must not have actually experienced like crime or harm. Or you're really privileged and that's why you're able to say these things. And I mean, arguments that I have against that, some of it's in my resource guide that y'all will be getting, but I don't really engage in arguments like that anymore. There's a lot of people who have written a lot of great books about the subject. There's presentations like this, there's websites, etc., that people can go to. So I don't really argue with people. If people have specific questions that they want me to answer, I make sure that I'm consistently reading and consistently doing research to back up what I'm saying. But I find that if I'm arguing with people, it actually drains me a lot and I'm unable to focus on organizing anymore. So how do I respond? Usually I'm just like, I'll give an example at my job. Someone keeps like don't tell anyone, but someone keeps like trying to like argue with me about prison abolition. And so usually I'll try to like end the conversation and then, wait, can y'all hear me? Okay, sorry, everyone was frozen. I'll usually just try to end the conversation and then maybe like a couple of weeks later be like, oh, hey, here's an article I found. And the article is like disproving like a couple of the points that they were relying on. But yeah, I don't really argue that much anymore. Sylvie put in the chat, they have a great, Project Let's has a great video about how to help a friend experiencing suicidal ideation without calling 911. Marilyn said, are there any abolitionist doctors or public health workers who are doing much needed work at the intersection of the medical industrial complex and the prison industrial complex whose work you recommend to learn more from? Actually, I don't know. I was looking for some people when I was making this presentation and I couldn't really find any. I do organize with people who work within public health, and they actually do it for the mayor's office in New York. And so because of that, they aren't public facing because their organizing work like directly contradicts their paid job. But if anyone else has any recommendations, I'd be glad to hear it. Like I said, I know a lot of abolitionist social workers, but not many people, not many doctors. Okay, Maya. Maya had a great recommendation for people affiliated with Project South in Atlanta. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think that's it. I'll put my email in the chat because now that I'm not doing public speaking, I do have like more time to like answer individual questions if you think of them. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. Wait, that was not the end of the presentation. I just realized. I guess we'll send out the slides. There was just like a final slide that I totally forgot about. I'm sorry.
All good.
Yeah, that's fine.